Good evening. After having examined the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, we're going to talk about his great critic and successor, in a sense, namely Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who lived between 1770 and 1831. Someone has used the term twin towers to characterize the two major philosophers of Greek classical antiquity, Plato and Aristotle. In a similar sense, it is possible to talk about the twin towers of the classical German philosophy, the modern era, and these twin towers are Kant and Hegel, of course. There are also several other significant philosophers who contributed to this thriving of philosophy in a relatively short period of approximately 40 years. This is the classical German philosophy or German idealism. So, besides Kant and Hegel, we have also Fichte or Schelling or Jacobi or Schleiermacher, other important philosophers. And afterwards, we have Schopenhauer, who was a critic of them all. But the two greatest among them were Kant and Hegel. And we talk about succession between them. Hegel developed his thoughts by trying to overcome Kant, while on the other hand, remaining true to him, retaining certain central thoughts and concepts and principles of him. Hegel was not a direct pupil of Kant, only indirectly had learned about his philosophy, but nevertheless, his development would have been impossible without the study of Kantian philosophy, and it is essential that we have to know much about Kant, to have studied him very well, in order just to be able to understand Hegel afterwards. Hegel was born in 1770 in Stuttgart, in southwest Germany. He was raised by his family, a family of middle class employees, relatively wealthy, and he studied philosophy and theology in nearby Tübingen between 1788 to 1793, together with his friends Schelling and the poet Friedrich Hölderlin. Afterwards, he did not become a priest, as he was initially bound to become. So he changed his career plans and he became, like Kant before him and others, a house preceptor, and he moved to Bern, to Switzerland. And then he made a second stage in this path, and became a preceptor in Frankfurt later on, towards the end of the 18th century. The first important turning point was the assumption of a position in Jena, in today's East Germany, where his friend Schelling was before him there, had become a professor of philosophy, and Hegel began his career there in 1800s, and the next year he wrote the first eponymously signed work, a major critical essay, the so-called Differenzschrift, the difference of the philosophical systems of Fichte and Schelling. And he stayed 5 to 6 years there. At the final stage, he wrote a major work, the Phenomenology of Spirits, die Phänomenologie des Geistes. This was written between 1805 and 1806. And you can see English translations using both the term mind and spirit. This is one of the many difficulties we have to face when we study Hegel. Because term Geist in German usually denotes what we call spirit, something spiritual, or in Hegel's sense, something that exteriorizes itself, while mind relates to our subjective cognitive faculties. And we can see that Hegel employs actually both senses of the term. But this is one of the many difficulties. We should not be discouraged by that. And of course, we should show patience, resilience while we study such a difficult philosopher, which on the other hand is an important and interest one. And it's of course impossible in this presentation to analyze everything of his achievements. We only want to outline some main points, and of course, this is even more important, to give some motivation to study this great man in depth. In 1806, the French armies under Napoleon conquered Vienna after a major battle against the enemies, against the Prussians and the Austrians. And Hegel showed his admiration of Napoleon, who entered the city by saying that Napoleon was the world soul on a horse, riding on a horse. He was, nevertheless, this change was a blow to him. He lost his job. He had to move elsewhere, and he worked as a journalist in a town in Bayern, Bavaria, in Bamberg, for a year, and then he became director of a school in Nuremberg for 8 years without having the possibility to teach at the university. He wrote this time his most systematic work, Die Wissenschaft der Logik, the science of logic, 2 volumes work, where he systematically develops categories, logical categories, which on the other hand should also express the constitution of reality. It's not only formal logic actually, but also a set of notions designed and developed to explain the really existing world. Then he found finally the desired possibility to become university professor, and he became this in Heidelberg in 1816. He stayed 2 years there, and he taught systematically his philosophical doctrine, and he published the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, die Enzyklopädie der philosophischen Wissenschaften. This is 3 volumes work comprising the subjective logic. This is the first part of the encyclopedia. The objective logic, the philosophy of nature, and then the absolute spirit. This is the first time he develops this concept, the absolute spirit, which consists of 3 components: art, religion, and philosophy. The highest stage is philosophy, but also art and religion are very powerful categories. And then he found the possibility to improve his position even more by becoming a professor of philosophy in the capital of Prussia, in Berlin. He became professor there at the Berlin University in 1818. And he stayed there, he taught for 13 years until the 14th November 1831, when he died of cholera suddenly. And this interrupted his teaching activity at the university. He taught a lot. He was very popular at that time, had a great reputation. It was like a pilgrimage from several parts of Europe, many people who traveled to Berlin just to hear him, although, as it is reported, he was not so brilliant in talking, not great orator, but nevertheless, his teaching was very successful. And this is a major problem while trying to interpret him. We know for sure that he was a philosopher of freedom, Philosoph der Freiheit. And this notion corresponds to what he himself wrote in a letter to his friend Schelling in the middle of the last decade of the 18th century, approximately 1795. Our slogan is reason and freedom, Vernunft und Freiheit. And our point of assembly is the invisible church, die unsichtbare Kirche. This means that he tries, or he has the vision to reconcile philosophy, politics, and religion. And this can be seen clearly within his systematic work. The last work he published officially while in his lifetime was the philosophy, the elements, so-called elements of the philosophy of right in 1821. This was to become a controversial work for some reasons relating to the political developments of that time. Notorious became this work because of his identification there between the logical and the real. Although this identification cannot be rendered adequately in English or in other languages. In German, we say we have on the one hand, vernünftig, corresponding to reason or resulting from reason, Vernunft, and on the other hand, we have not just the reality, Wirklichkeit. Wirklichkeit is something more than reality. Realität is actuality, the reality that becomes active, actualizes itself. And when he says that something logical is something real, or that everything logical is at the same time real, he does not necessarily mean that what is logical has already realized, has already become reality. Because if we say that everything logical has already become reality, we imply maybe that the reality surrounding us is the best possible reality, and there is no need for change to the institutions. And it would be not worthy to say, awkward or false, just false to say that the institution of that time did not need change, because the constitution of Russia was an absolute oppressive monarchy, something like that we had before in France, before the revolution. The King of Prussia had promised the citizens to grant them a constitution and to restrict his reign by this important element of modern parliamentary governance, but he had refrained from that. He withdrew his promise silently, so there was some dissatisfaction with him. But Hegel was a philosopher of the Prussian states, and some later interpreters of him found him guilty of that he was a philosopher who worked for this oppressive Prussian state. And this is why he was identified with National Socialism, the Nazis, or the Stalinists later on. But this is not the case. This is a superficial charge against him. He remains always a philosopher of Freiheit, of freedom, and he sought ways to develop his thoughts and to make them understandable and acceptable mainly by the minor works he published and by his teaching, his popular teaching in Berlin. And he was never accepted as a member of the Prussian Academy of Science. That this is enough to show us that he was not the official philosopher of the Prussian regime. If we want to study his difficult philosophy, we have many difficulties, as already said, but we have just as many possibilities, points of entrance. There are many concepts who can serve as introductory concepts. He is a systematic philosopher who can start by clarifying this. What does it concretely mean that he is a systematic philosopher? He was the last important systematic philosopher. Some other philosophers after him tried actually to develop something new with the ambition to incorporate in a single system everything that had been said before or everything that should be relevant for people who study philosophy and philosophize for themselves. There's no such another comparable achievement after Hegel. This means, on the other hand, that while we try to study his system, although it's almost impossible to learn everything and to appropriate critically every aspect of it, it's nevertheless possible to recognize within its structure, all major philosophical points and issues throughout the history of philosophy, and to pick up some major thoughts that still remain relevant for every philosophizing person. By the way, this is important to be stated also regarding Immanuel Kant, who had himself said it's not possible or it's not helpful to learn philosophy. Instead, we should learn to philosophize for ourselves. And this is the core belief, thesis of the genuinely philosophical attitude. Not by learning prefabricated philosophical thoughts, but by trying to practice philosophy for ourselves, that's the way we can approach this goal, this ideal of philosophy. We can make use of many Hegelian thoughts, and by doing this, we are able to understand the previous developments, Hegel's standpoint and achievements, and what remains useful and important for us 2 centuries afterwards. That Hegel is a living philosopher for us is obvious already by the fact that there are several possibilities and several tendencies to interpret him, and always new currents emerge and offer new approaches. For instance, this is critical point that Hegel was a philosopher of oppression, not of freedom. This was a thesis supported by certain Rudolf Heim in the 19th century or by Karl Popper in the 20th century. But this cannot withstand criticism. Nevertheless, if we study Hegel's development closely and his writings very thoroughly, attentively, meticulously, then we find that he's actually a philosopher of freedom, and freedom goes hand in hand with Vernunft, with reason. There is no other possibility when we talk of this culmination of rational philosophy, rational thoughts, of enlightenment. At the same time, we must speak of a philosophy of liberation, of genuine liberation, and of the opening of new possibilities to make our world a better place. The first major work, as we said already, is the Phenomenology of Spirit, published in 1806. There we have a combination of several issues, several thoughts. Is the work with the ambition to serve as a systematic work, but this planning was later abandoned by Hegel himself, and then he moved to the next stage, the science of logic. But nevertheless, the phenomenology of spirit is very important because there we find a very powerful statement, characteristic of his thoughts, that the absolute could not be reduced to the dimension of the substance, but it should include also the dimension of the subject. Substance refers to the objectively existing reality, a concept adopted from Spinoza through the mediation of other philosophers in between. Jacobi was one of them, and Fichte and Schelling as well. And Hegel was a supporter of Schelling in the initial stages of his development, but he realizes that if he wants to build a system, he has to take also the other aspects in consideration, the subjective one, as it was developed by Kant and then by Fichte as a critic and successor also of Kant. And phenomenology of spirits includes many major philosophical issues about perception, about knowledge, about the absolute knowledge at the end, many aspects about ethics and morals. He shows the inadequacy of the subjective morals as it was developed before him by Kant. He deals a lot with the history of philosophy, ideas, and politics as well. He devotes interesting chapters to the French Enlightenment and Revolution and the terror as a phase of decline after the revolution. And then he turns to the new era of the triumph of logic. And in this development, religion is also there. And religion has also undergone several stages of development. The science of logic has another structure. Here we have three parts: the logic of being, of Sein, Logik des Seins, and Logik des Wesens, logic of the essence or essence, not substance, because these concepts are similar and sometimes are confused. And then we have the logic of the concept, the Logik des Begriffs. He shows there that being as a category is something that seems very important, but it's nevertheless too abstract to be taken seriously, to serve as basis of all our reasoning and our arguments, because everything belongs to this category of being, of Sein, and this, although at first this category seems very powerful, very mighty, it proves to be very weak, because if everything belongs there, it's impossible to say concrete things about all aspects of reality. If everything is the same, then we can talk about nothing. Something like that. And then we have the other categories, and we see the scientific progress of that time included, of the structure, the concepts, and we are able to study the whole work closely and very, very better if we study it parallel to the Kantian critique of pure reason, because it's a vast commentary on the critique of pure reason, and of course with the ambition to improve it or to correct its mistakes and What's the major mistake? Major mistake of Kant for Hegel, what he insists a lot upon is the fact that Kant makes a sharp and irreconcilable division of two worlds, the world of our own thoughts and the external world, the things in themselves, die Dinge an sich selbst. We are unable, in principle, to learn exhaustively everything possible and everything necessary of our external world. While, on the other hand, just by saying this, that we are unable to attain perfect knowledge, we have already made a statement about the external world. So this absolute separation of two worlds proves to be problematic for Hegel, and Hegel wants to reconcile all aspects of our concepts and to unify two separate worlds. And this is the essence of what he calls absolute idealism. Every philosophy is idealistic for Hegel, and by that he means that every philosophy is is obliged to necessarily use philosophical abstractions, concepts. This is the material of philosophy. We cannot help but working with this material, with these concepts. And this is our own world, the world of philosophy, and everything belongs to this world, even what appears to be external to it. And this is why we are not advised to talk about the things in themselves outside our concepts. And Hegel uses actually the word concept in singular, der Begriff, the concept, and he means all the forms our thoughts can take. The ability, our own ability to build concepts, to philosophize. This is the concept in general, the concept as such. And again, the science of logic ends with the absolute idea, similar to the absolute knowledge we have in the phenomenology. If we are aware of the way our thought works, then we are able to make use of it in the best possible way. And another important, interesting statement of this work, the science of logic, is, and what shows the systematic ambition, that in this work, so Hegel, are contained the thoughts of God before the creation of the world. Something testifying the absolute, the orientation thought towards the absolute. Then we have the encyclopedic system and its parts, its expansions. We have the philosophy of nature belonging to the system, but constituting, on the other hand, something independent of it. It's the exteriorization of the subjective spirit, the alienation, and as some say, Äußerung oder Entfremdung. The thought becomes something else, pure thoughts, subjective fabrications of our spirit, our concepts in general. They are recognizable also in the realm of nature, but they have already become something else. And then we have again the reconciliation, and this takes place in two stages here. We have the objective spirit. The objective spirit is the whole of human culture and human institutions. Then we have morals, ethics, and we have the civil society or the bourgeois society, the bürgerliche Gesellschaft, this society of the citizens who have political rights and economic power. And these are the motor, the formation of the institutions. And the highest institution is the state as such. Not some particular state, but the state as the most important institution of humans living together and respecting each other as it should be. But there is also the next stage, the philosophy of the absolute spirit. Here we have art, religion, and philosophy. All of these forms of these stages deal with the absolute. The absolute is something mysterious, but something sublime, something powerful, something exceeding, transcending everything else. We can think of it, but we cannot easily grasp it adequately. This is, in a sense, the problem. And the three stages of the absolute spirit are relatively approaches, but the philosophy is the highest and the best of the stages. And why is art and religion inferior to philosophy? Because they are obliged to use external means to help them transporting the message or grasp the content and so on. The art, at the level of art, we have all these pictures, sounds, technical means, the production, the necessity to produce beautiful images and very nice works in general, sculptures, whatever. And this is an indication or an argument of the incompleteness of art. Religion, as such, does not have such a strong need to use these external means because it can convey a spiritual content and message. The persons turn to themselves, to their inner self, in order to grasp the absolutes, the divinity, but on the other hand, religion remains something dependent on external factors, as far as it is an institution or a form of culture obliged to use some forms of narration to convince people and to make the message easier and more attractive. Narrations, myths, or songs, or allegories, all this stuff. But philosophy is in principle independent of all external factors. Philosophy can speak for herself. This is the power of philosophy, and this is why philosophy constitutes the highest stage of the absolute spirit. And when we have learned philosophy, this is Hegel's point of view, then we are able to deal with all other forms of human culture. To this whole system belong also the expansions, as we see here, that is, the lectures Hegel gave in Berlin in the third decade of the 19th century. These lectures were not published in his lifetime, were later edited by pupils and friends, and only by great efforts, through great efforts, could be incorporated to his published works. So the whole of the bulk of great bulk Hegel's intellectual production has not yet been ultimately completed. There are some works which are still to be published from these lectures, but these lectures are very interesting. They have a great richness in their content, and they are useful if one wants to study him without having to take this risk to be discouraged by the difficult parts of his concepts. An idea that is very helpful in this sense, it's what Hegel believes, that human spirit, human culture, philosophy as such have history. We can study philosophy and we can reach the highest stage of philosophical thoughts if we reconstruct its development through the ages. And this is why Hegel writes a philosophy of history, his famous for, and the history of philosophy as well. This is he is the first major historian of philosophy of our times, at least, because he imitates the ancient Aristotle in a sense, although Aristotle had not written something with this ambition, a historical reconstruction of all philosophy. And the main idea here is that every philosophy of the past had something important, something new, something original to say, to contribute to the eternal quest for truth. And every philosophy makes the next stage and next appearance, philosophical thought, possible and plausible. And because Hegel occupies the last stage, the highest stage, this last stage is the highest. Every philosopher before him had worked in order to prepare his appearance, his emergence. And this is why he speaks, in the most cases, positively about the philosophers of the past. Even philosophers he criticizes elsewhere are important predecessors of him. Some or another, only one point, just a point to be mentioned here is what Hegel thinks about dialectic, a crucial concept of him, and very misunderstood concept as well. He says that a philosopher who had developed this very idea of dialectic was Heraclitus, the ancient philosopher. But on the other hand, he takes up many aspects of the later and influential Platonic dialectic. And here we have the encounter and the combination of two possibilities to develop this dialectic. Concept operating in the by combining three stages each time: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. This is the most simplified way to make sense of it. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. First stage, the negation of the first, and then the negation of the second, which in a sense constitutes the return to the original, to the initial one. And this signifies also a process of progress. And what Hegel wants us to think here is that this progress is actually achieved, and we have to respect both the Platonic and the Heraclitean dialectic, because if we talk about Plato, we mean that we employ these concepts by paying attention to their peculiarities, their specific meanings. And if we refer to Heraclitus, who talks a lot about the antithetical structure of our world, the transition from the one stage to the other, then we see also that our concepts entail this differences, oppositions, and antitheses, but we are at the same time aware that these oppositions, antitheses, or contradictions, Widersprüche, as Hegel says, uh, refer to a world existing independent of us. And in this sense, dialectic becomes objective. Although, at the same time, we should be aware that this world existing independent of us is exactly the world of our own thoughts. So, very important is also Hegel's philosophy of history. He tries to justify or to defend the role of God in our history, in our reality, because this role was and can even today be very doubted, very disputed. All the evil that surrounds us can be seen as a proof of the absence of God from our world. If God were really present and if he were really what we think of him, then he would take care of us and would not have abandoned us to the arbitrary will of the uh, villains of history, or all oppression, all murders, and so on and so forth. Hegel tries to show that, of course, there is much evil in the world, that people learn nothing from history and commit every time the same errors or the same crimes. They are driven by self-interest. This is what we have to recognize, to accept. But in the long run, reason, Vernunft, prevails. Prevails. This is Hegel's message. Because reason uses selfish and criminal people to achieve its own goals, to lead culture to the next stages of progress. And there is a progress if we see history as a whole, because in the ancient world we have two subdivisions. We have at first the Eastern civilization, the Oriental civilization, the very ancient monarchies, where, as Hegel says, there was freedom, but freedom restricted only to one person, the person of the absolute monarch. All other people were his subjects, in the pejorative, in the negative sense, were tools in his hands. But then we achieved progress. If we study the ancient, the classical Greek world and civilization, freedom came to spread to more people, some people, a minority, but of course this was better. Minority free citizens in ancient Athens and Sparta and so forth, and in ancient Rome as well later on. But we had this enlargement of freedom. and the development of new forms of culture, ancient Greek art and philosophy, theater, music, all these things. And in Rome, we had, in the same pattern, further development, further progress, because there we have the introduction of developed political institutions, mainly of the Roman law that enabled them all. And that's why we had an enduring empire lasting for many centuries. And the next major transformation was the development of the individual, the value of the individual, of subjective freedom. Every singular person counts, and this is the message that became very powerful by the emergence of Christianity within the Roman world. Then this is the condition that all people become free. This is what philosophy wants to achieve and what Hegel sees as already being achieved, being accomplished in the modern Western European world, the world of Germanic peoples, as he says. And this should not be confused with the Germans. Germanic peoples are all peoples descending from the ancient Germanic tribes, and to this broad family belong also the ancestors of modern French, modern English, and most peoples Central Europe. And this is the dominant force shaping our civilization. And here we have the most developed institutions, mainly the institution of the constitutional monarchy, which is the best form of government for Hegel's time, because it combines and reconciles the one-sided forms or the extremes. After the revolution, after the terror, we have this a new equilibrium, a balance of opposing forces. We have the monarch and at the same time the institutions that both transform the power from top down and that control to some extent the absolute regent, the state. So there are many points to think about Hegel, food for thought. If something strikes your attention, then please let me know. After having studied all these things, I would like to finish by a crucial sentence from Hegel's Philosophy of Right and other famous statements from this work of political philosophy and ethical philosophy and constitutional thought, but mainly political philosophy. He says there that no one is able to overcome his own shadow, spring above it. And this is metaphor to say that, to explain the other sentence, that philosophy is nothing else but a form to express in a concise form one's own time through thoughts. Philosophie ist nichts anderes als ihre Zeit in Gedanken erfasst, Gedanken, thoughts. This is what philosophy operates with, thoughts, but these thoughts can express nothing more and nothing less than one's own time. In this sense is Hegel's philosophy, as every philosophy, historically conditioned, restricted, historically determined. This is a very important message. This is a very good argument to divorce ourselves from every philosophy, every form of thoughts having claims to absolute truth, to eternal truth. There are no eternal truths, but on the other hand, if the philosophy had a very close relationship to her own time, then and only then there is the possibility to discover some value of this philosophy beyond its age. And there are actually many points worth discussing, inspired by Hegel's thoughts nowadays. I just say that there are philosophers who had rejected him as a metaphysician, obsolete thinker, but nowadays we have philosophers who approach him with the tools and the power of modern thought, of analytical philosophy. And so Hegel becomes always our own contemporary philosopher. So it is enough for today, and next week we pass over to Hegel's great successor and influential philosopher, Karl Marx, and then we make also at the beginning the new year a presentation of Friedrich Nietzsche as the final stage of 19th century philosophy. Thank you very much, and we meet next time.